Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our May Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Grand Rounds. I'm pleased to introduce today Dr. Ted Bushane, who is the Joan N. Huber Social and Behavioral Sciences Faculty Fellow Professor in the Department of Psychology at Ohio State University. Ted began his academic career here at the University of Washington. And between the years 2000 and 2010, he was a shining star on our psychology department faculty. Ted is a trailblazer in the area of the biology of behavior. His research focuses on the neural and physiological substrate underlying childhood psychopathology. He investigates transdiagnostic vulnerability markers such as emotion dysregulation and behavioral impulsivity, and transdiagnostic biomarkers such as heart rate variability, transdermal, electrodermal responding, cortical volume, and function. His body has contributed to our understanding of conduct disorder, ADHD, anxiety disorder, depression, autism spectrum disorder, borderline personality disorder, and comorbid disorders with important implications for intervention and prevention. His academic career could be characterized as both generative and collaborative. Ted has won a number of teaching and mentoring awards, including here at University of Washington and at Ohio State. He served as dissertation chair for 3 current members of our child psychiatry faculty, Hillary Mead, Kate Bowen, and Emily Neuhaus. A fun fact is that in the year 2009, in an article published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology, Ted wrote a paper that was co-authored by 6 of students for whom he was the primary mentor. They were the co-authors. Ted has published 17 articles in the preeminent journal Development and Psychopathology, where he is a member of the editorial board. He's currently collaborating with the journal's editor, Dante Cacchetti, to produce a special issue on emotion dysregulation and emerging psychopathology. He's written a number of books. His book, Child and Adolescent Psychopathology, co-authored with Stephen Henshaw, is in its 3rd edition. And this year, 2019, he and Sheila Crowell, also a former UW doctoral student, are publishing a book with Oxford Press, Handbook of Emotion Dysregulation. In 2017, Ted was honored by the American Psychological Association with a mid-career award for outstanding contributions to benefit children, youth, and families. His talk today will be on the etiological complexity of impulsive behavior from preschool to adolescence for boys and girls. Please join me in welcoming Ted back to Seattle and to our Grand Rounds podium today.
Thank you, Anne, for that very generous introduction. It's hard to start after that. It's also great to see former students. I see Kate there. I can't see very far with my eyesight these days, but I can see Kate. So let me get started. First of all, I'm delighted to be back in Seattle and to be invited to speak at your Grand Round series. I remember doing this 17 years ago as a second-year assistant professor and being so afraid that I was shaking. And so for anyone who's at that stage of their career, it gets better. In some ways, it gets worse in others. So let's get started. First, I want to acknowledge some collaborators and funding sources. And so we do a number of different things in our what we call lifespan adjustment project at Ohio State. I'm only going to have a chance to talk about some of those things today. I would like to talk about, here we go. I would like to talk about some of our intervention work for ADHD and conduct problems, but I won't be able to get to that. And so what I'll focus on today is our work on etiology of externalizing disorders and etiology of self-injury and borderline personality development. So let me go ahead and get started with that. And so objectives for today: first, describe development of impulsive behavior from preschool to adulthood across several different levels of analysis that are relevant for any understanding of the phenomenon that we're talking about, for those reared specifically in high-risk environments. We know and have known for a long time, since Lee Robbins at WashU wrote Deviant Children Grown Up in 1966, that males who end up diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder follow a very typical developmental trajectory. And that begins in preschool with hyperactivity and impulsivity. And that's followed or develops in concurrence with oppositionality and aggression. In middle school, we see school conduct problems and suspensions, disengagement and withdrawal from school. Academic problems emerge. In adolescence, we see delinquent peer group affiliations, drug use and criminality, and then in adulthood, incarceration and recidivism. And of course, I'm not suggesting that everyone, every child with ADHD follows this developmental trajectory. Nothing could be further from the truth. What I am saying is that almost all males who were incarcerated with ASPD followed a developmental trajectory that was very similar to this. And so we need to understand this trajectory. Not only why are some individuals pulled along this trajectory, but how do others get off? And so if we were to diagnose one individual who followed this developmental trajectory, we would diagnose him, and I say him because the sex ratio is 7 or 8 to 1, we would diagnose this person with ADHD early in life, followed by oppositional defiant disorder, early onset conduct disorder, substance use and dependencies, and antisocial personality disorder. One of the things that we've done in our many of our papers is question whether this makes a lot of sense to be diagnosing with all these different disorders and what the effect of doing that is. And a couple of effects are to create different literatures that aren't necessarily cross-talking with one another in terms of diagnosis, in terms of treatment and prevention. I also want to present some new data on impulsive girls who are understudied to date. They're finally getting some of the attention that they deserve. Embrace etiological complexity. No single level of analysis, whether it be genes, neural functions, maltreatment, neighborhood risk, accounts for progression of impulsivity to more severe developmental endpoints. I think we're at a point now where we're beginning to understand that large single effects are not going to be found for development of impulsive behavior or most anything else in psychopathology, and that we have to get used to this idea that there are a lot of complex contributors of small effect size. Consider complex interactions and transactions between and among endogenous vulnerabilities internal to the child and exogenous risk factors across development. And that includes multifactorial genetic burden, subcortical neural mechanisms of impulsivity, differential neuromaturation of cortical versus subcortical neural networks, cortical-subcortical connectivity, environmentally induced neuroplastic changes in cortical structure and function. And so I'll talk about all of those things today. And so for now, I hope you'll indulge me with an example and an open mind. I want to talk about development of type 2 diabetes before I move on to externalizing behavior. So we all know about development of type 2 diabetes. I love to use this example. It's probably not so important for this audience, but most of the places I go, I have to provide an example that that resonates with most people. And so we know that for the development of type 2 diabetes at the syndrome level, we see insulin resistance, followed by pancreatic beta cell death, weight gain, metabolic syndrome, heart disease, renal failure, and at the end state, peripheral neuropathy, amputation. Those syndromes all load on a single highly heritable trait, and that trait is, heritability coefficients are about 0.8 for that trait. We also know at the multifactorial genetic burden level that there are at least 40 genes that are implicated in vulnerability to type 2 diabetes. None of those genes are necessary or sufficient for the disorder. We also know, in spite of the fact that diabetes is so highly heritable, that environmental risk mechanisms pull individuals along this developmental trajectory. So fat and sugar intake, lack of exercise, stress, and poor self-care, facilitate progression. And in the absence of these risk factors, in more protective environments, someone may not traverse this developmental pathway. And so I want to compare that to the development of externalizing behavior disorders. So we know at the syndrome level, as we've already discussed, that ADHD is often followed by ODD, CD and delinquency, substance use and dependence, antisocial personality disorder, incarceration, and recidivism. At the latent vulnerability level, we also have a single heritable trait that all of these disorders load on in the parlance of structural equation modeling. The heritability coefficient is almost identical to the case of type 2 diabetes. Ian Geiser has written a couple of very nice review papers that show molecular genetic vulnerability is also multifactorial. There's not a single genetic vulnerability that's necessary or sufficient for development of externalizing behavior. So the parallels are actually pretty remarkable. And we also know from an expansive literature that there are environmental risk mechanisms that pull some individuals along this developmental trajectory, whereas others are protected if they're reared in protective environments. So coercion, abuse, maltreatment will figure prominently in the second half of my talk. Deviant peer group affiliations, availability, opportunity, and exposure to substances of abuse, neighborhood violence, and criminality. And that just names a few. And we also know, and as I said, in the absence of these risk factors, in higher SES neighborhoods, this progression is much less likely. Don Lynam's work is a good example of that. So let me talk about trait impulsivity as a behavioral construct before moving on. Trait impulsivity, the way we conceptualize it, is an individual difference. When extreme, it's characterized by preference for immediate rewards over delayed rewards, actions taken without forethought, failures to plan ahead, deficiencies in self-control. So all of the hallmarks of the hyperactive, impulsive, and combined subtypes of ADHD or presentations of ADHD in DSM-5 terms. As an individual difference, as any individual difference, trait impulsivity is a normally distributed personality trait. So someone can be restrained at the very left end of the distribution, if you will. And then moving over, we see unimpulsive people, average impulsive people, whatever that means, exuberant people. Many of us are probably exuberant people. Some of us are even probably impulsive people. Maybe that's TMI. Trait impulsivity is highly heritable, stable across development, one of the most stable individual differences that we've identified, rooted in well-characterized brain processes that often become canalized, as I've put in quotes here. I get pilloried for using that term sometimes, but I'll explain what I mean. Canalized specifically in context of environmental risk. So moving to subcortical emotional substrates of trait impulsivity. We know from an extensive and long-standing body of research that approach-related emotions like wanting, seeking, enthusiasm, even craving, are generated in large part by striatal reactivity in anticipation of incentives. This literature is enormous. And here is a slide from Brian Knutson's original monetary incentive delay task way back in 2001, and this has become the most popular task for measuring striatal responding to incentives in the scanner. And here we see a strong striatal response to monetary incentives. Striatal activity and reactivity to appetitive stimuli, including monetary incentives, are associated with positive hedonic capacity and states. In contrast, striatal underactivity is associated with anhedonia, irritability, and discontentment. These are hallmarks of externalizing disorders, but this also helps us understand why there's so much comorbidity between externalizing disorders and unipolar depression. We don't have time to talk about that today, but Amy Zisner was a graduate student who is now in private practice, who co-authored a paper with me on this. Striatal hyporesponding to incentives is widely replicated in ADHD and other externalizing disorders, and I've listed just some of the papers that show that here. So this is from Schurz et al. From 2007, one of the early studies where they show striatal underresponding among those with ADHD. So we've got control adolescents here showing a strong striatal response to monetary incentives in the scanner, and then we're not seeing anything here, at least in this experiment for those with ADHD. Now, it's not that we don't see striatal responding to rewards in children with ADHD. It's just a less robust response, if that's the right word. And so if we look here at different values of monetary incentive and look at ADHD, the ADHD curve compared with the control curve, we see about an equivalent level of responding for $1 among controls versus $5 among those with ADHD. So it takes more to sort of recruit or elicit the same levels of neural reactivity among children with ADHD. They don't get the same bang for their buck, if you will, literally. Here. This is from Plichta and Schur's now famous meta-analysis. There weren't an enormous number of studies, but invariably all studies in which monetary incentives were used in the scanner, children with ADHD show lower levels of striatal responding to monetary incentives. This is a study that just came out last year in JAMA Psychiatry by Lugin et al. I hope I said that right. I have no idea. But we see alcohol, cannabis, cocaine, and nicotine dependence. And this includes those who were addicted in both abstinent and mixed abstinent in active phases of addiction, and we see hypoactivation to monetary incentives across the board. Now, of course, it could be a downstream consequence of substance use in these cases, but nevertheless, we're seeing this similar pattern. According to reward-seeking models, discontentment and irritability motivate reward-seeking behavior, impulsivity, substance use, etc., and that temporarily upregulates aversive mood. However, any mood elevation is transient, and so affected individuals continually seek external reinforcers, like we see in children, adolescents, and adults with ADHD. John Constantino at Wash U and I recently wrote a paper about the overwhelming complexity of striatal function. And so at one point when I was young and naive, I thought, okay, now we understand this. And now I get that we don't understand it at all. Probably a more accurate way to put it is that it's overwhelmingly complex to a level where there are no necessary or sufficient causes. And so let me explain what I mean. So sort of to review where we've come so far, we've got this neurobiological vulnerability, blunted striatal responding to rewards, At the emotional level, that's experienced as an anhedonic irritable mood state. At the normative behavioral level of analysis, we've got a behavioral bias toward reward seeking. And at the syndromal level of analysis, we've got trait impulsivity and ADHD. Now, at the neurobiological level of analysis, blunted striatal responding is affected by all sorts of things. And so here we've got, and I hope this shows up well enough for people to see, we've got genetic liability burden, and I'm only listing a subset of these vulnerabilities: dopamine transporter receptor, serotonin transporter, calcium channel vulnerability alleles, heritable copy number variants, de novo genetic mutations. All of those contribute. Then we've got environmental influences, including traumatic brain injury, hypoxia, teratogen exposures, epigenetic regulation of receptor function that can be affected by prenatal inputs. And then we've got neurohormonal modulators, including testosterone levels, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis function, and for women, estradiol and progesterone levels. And that later finding I was just made aware of by someone who's doing some fantastic work at UIC, Tori Eisenhower-Moll. It's really exciting new work and helps explain some sex differences. So how about cortical contributions? I've been talking about the subcortex, the striatum. This, of course, shows some functional subdivisions of the prefrontal cortex. And then underneath that, of course, is the subcortex. And I've subdivided the motivation and emotion generation on the subcortical side and behavior and emotion regulation on the cortical side. That's slightly an artificial distinction, but it's still a useful heuristic, even in 2019. We, of course, subscribe, most of us, to the traditional model that the cortex helps downregulate strong emotional responses that originate in the subcortex. So that's important for our understanding of emotion regulation, emotion dysregulation, one's ability to modulate strong emotional responses, including behavioral impulsivity. These data are from the Brain Development Cooperative Group, and this shows development of the caudate nucleus and the putamen, both striatal structures. Here we've got age on the x-axis from 4.8 years to 18.3 years. This is a pretty long developmental span. And then we've got cubic centimeters here. So we've got small neural structures here, 16 at the top of the y-axis here in cubic centimeters and 14 here for the putamen. And we've got different lines for boys in blue versus girls in red. And we see, at least volumetrically, that these subcortical structures are fully mature at age 5. There's probably some functional neurodevelopment that's going on, or I should say neuromaturational functional differences or individual differences that are going on. But volumetrically, there's full maturity at age 5. And that, of course, contrasts really sharply with what's going on frontally. So here we've got frontal gray matter and frontal white matter development across the same age range. And what you'll notice here on the y-axis is that we're dealing with much larger volumes, of course, because it's the entire frontal cortex. And we've got a lot of gray matter pruning going on across age 5 to 18, and a lot of white matter growth going on. But the bottom line here is that there's a lot of neurodevelopment, as everyone in this room knows, going on in the frontal cortex across this age range, as children and adolescents are learning to regulate their emotions and their behavior more effectively. That differential neuromaturation, of course, has been used to explain engagement in normative risky behaviors. This is a famous graph from B.J. Casey's group, who's at Yale now, showing subcortical neurodevelopment occurring more quickly than cortical neurodevelopment, and then this risky period where there's a maximum difference, where kids are engaging in all kinds of behaviors. Anyone who has one knows, and unfortunately, this doesn't end. My daughter's 25, so I'm hoping that it's finally ended, but actually it has. Now we're starting to map much more. And so this is a paper that just appeared in the Journal of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry by Hauser et al. And shows different developmental trajectories of a number of different neural systems. So we've got mesocortical projections here, we've got mesolimbic projections, striatal receptors, prefrontal receptors. The difference that we just talked about between cortical and subcortical development is right here. But we're starting to get a much more nuanced view of brain development. It's a really interesting paper to read. We see delayed neuromaturation of the prefrontal cortex among males who progress to conduct disorder. This is a paper by DeBrito et al. It's now 10 years old, but it shows that across ages 10 to 13.5, we don't see the gray matter pruning that we expect to see among males with conduct disorder compared with controls. So frontal neuromaturation at best is lagging and at worst isn't happening. We know that in some studies of children with ADHD, there's a 2-year lag. It may be even worse for some who experience severe conduct problems. This is a study, the first neuroimaging study we ever did. Kate Bowen was involved in this, intricately involved in this. And so here we have an image showing controls responding to monetary incentives in the scanner, and we're seeing striatal activation as we would expect. And then we took the money away, and so these kids are expecting, or adolescents I should say, they were 12 to 18, they're expecting to receive a reinforcer for the same behavior that they were emitting before, and we take it away, and they shift neural activity forward to the anterior cingulate cortex, which is very consistent with the error monitoring function of the anterior cingulate cortex, so not a big surprise. When we compare that with adolescents with ADHD and conduct disorder, we see neural recruitment in the striatum during reward responding. When we take the monetary incentive away, however, they continue to recruit striatal brain regions instead of shifting neural activity forward to the anterior cingulate cortex. So there's a perseverative sort of quality to what's going on here. In that same study, we evaluated connectivity between the cortex and the subcortex, and we saw significant bottom-up connectivity between the caudate, a striatal structure, and the anterior cingulate. We saw significant connectivity bottom-up from the caudate to the ACC in those with ADHD too, but it was less, and the difference was significant. When we looked at top-down connectivity, we saw significant connectivity in controls, but none in those with ADHD and conduct disorder, and that was a significant difference as well. So I want to move to environmental effects on PFC neuromaturation. Environmental adversities affect PFC neuromaturation strongly, and this is a reference to Joan Luby's paper in Pediatrics in 2015, and they had a number of different studies in that issue. Poverty in particular, children who live below federal poverty level show a 7 to 10% reduction in frontal volumes compared with controls. And these data are from Seth Pollack's group at the University of Wisconsin. And this shows frontal gray matter development from age 5 months to 37 months among children who are reared in high SES environments, mid SES environments, and low SES environments. And we're supposed to be seeing gray matter development over this period of time. And yet, and we are for all groups, but the difference across this really important period of time in a child's life is fairly substantial. And of course, it's not SES per se that's causing this difference. We can speculate about nutritional deficiencies and all sorts of other influences. Nevertheless, the finding is very important, and it's replicated. Child abuse and neglect, which is common in externalizing samples, is associated with dose-response reductions in orbital frontal cortex volumes. This is also from Pollack's group at University of Wisconsin. It's a paper written by Jamie Hansen, who's now at Pittsburgh. Institutionalization, children remaining in orphanages exhibit smaller cortical volumes than controls, and they make some of this up when they're adopted away. And this is some work by Katie McLaughlin, who many of you probably know. Neural predictors and sequelae of substance use. We see blunted striatal responses to reward are associated with vulnerability to marijuana, cocaine, methamphetamine abuse, and addiction 3 years later. This is really, really impressive work from Susan Tapert's group at UCSD. So prospective prediction, of course, is the gold standard in our work. Heavy drinking in adolescence is associated with faster gray matter loss and slower white matter growth in the cortex over 2 years. And so here we have frontal, cingulate, and total gray matter volume, and we're supposed to be seeing reductions in gray matter volume, of course, across adolescence, but those reductions are accelerated among heavy drinking adolescents in all frontal regions that were explored in this study. In terms of white matter, we see less white matter growth in the same sample for those who engage in heavy drinking. So it appears that heavy alcohol use is having an effect on frontal neuromaturation among kids who are already at risk. We also see in that sample poor subcortical cortical connectivity. So the bottom line in my very, very quick sort of summary of the literature, the way that we think of it is that by the time many impulsive children who, through no fault of their own, are born, inherited this impulsivity trait, by the time they reach adolescence, their existing subcortical vulnerabilities are amplified by environmental adversities and risk exposures, which alter neurodevelopment of cortical brain regions that are critical to self and emotion regulation. So there are people, I always say this, there are people in this room who are highly impulsive probably. There are people in this room who are highly anxious. But if we can recruit the frontal resources to modulate that anxiety, to modulate that impulsivity, we can do all of the things that other people do. If we don't have those resources, all sorts of ill effects emerge across the lifespan, and I'll talk more about that moving forward. And so here's our elaborated neurodevelopmental model. So we've got the same things that I've talked about so far, ADHD progressing to more severe externalizing problems in certain contexts, environmental contexts, and this trait impulsivity, this heritable factor that's subcortically rooted early in life, contributes to all of these. But then we've got self and emotion dysregulation, which is more cortical and highly socialized and dependent on environmental risk and protective factors, that this becomes more important across development as individuals progress. And for those who don't progress, we often, at least according to our prediction, wouldn't see this, these problems with self-emotion regulation, and probably see less functional compromises in brain structure and function across development. What are some implications for prevention? And I want to quickly review the NIMH Fast Track prevention trial, which was conducted in part here. So there were 4 sites, Seattle, Durham, Nashville, and rural Pennsylvania. And 891 high-risk kindergartners were enrolled from 10,000 children. And the 891 high-risk kids were identified based on parent-teacher reports of early conduct problems. They were enrolled in an intensive 10-year-long prevention program. It began in 1991. And The intensive nature of the program is illustrated by these sort of summary bullets. There were 57 two-hour sessions with parents, children, program staff, and teachers that targeted self-control, emotional awareness, peer relations, and problem solving. That's a lot of sessions for a prevention program. Parents were taught to tutor their children academically. So parents are enlisted in this program. This is not a child-only program. There were monthly family sessions, home visits, and there was teacher-implemented prevention. There were monthly parent and child groups and home visits, and there were individual sessions addressing high school transition, including note-taking, study skills, and the like. So this is a multi-component prevention delivered across many years. It's not the kind of thing that we typically do because of expense. There were limited effects of this intervention in the early years, and in fact, Fast Track almost wasn't refunded for their competing renewal because the data weren't supporting its efficacy. Somehow, there were some really good people on this. They convinced NIH to give them the money for the second 5 years. Effects, however, accrued through age 25. So at age 25, and this paper just came out a couple of years ago, the intervention or prevention group showed fewer externalizing problems, less substance abuse, less violent crime convictions, less internalizing problems, lower high-risk sexual behavior, and fewer drug convictions than the non-treated kids. And the effect sizes were medium to large. So investing in targeting, and investing in kids and targeting known mechanisms of progression of externalizing behavior had effects, but those, again, took many years to show up. This contrasts with long-term outcomes of the NIMH multimodal treatment of ADHD study, where effects were time-limited, and that was a time-limited intervention. Now, of course, it's not the same groups of kids, but I think there's a general message in the difference. The MTA enrollees are not doing well in their mid-20s. Prevention programs that target mediating mechanisms of externalizing progression are effective when they're delivered early, when they involve parents, and when they teach children effective self-regulation strategies. So what about girls? Most of the data that I presented so far are derived from samples that are overwhelmingly boys. And that's just the nature of impulsive behavior and externalizing. You recruit at the 95th or 98th percentile, you're going to get 7 or 8 boys for every girl. Our more recent work is focused on girls. Developmental pathways of impulsivity haven't been well characterized in girls. In 2009, we wrote a couple of review papers that sort of led us to studying girls. One was in Development and Psychopathology, the other was in Psychological Bulletin. And we noted a few things in those 2 review papers. One is that similar family interaction patterns appear to be occurring for delinquent boys and self-injuring girls. And these studies are different studies finding similar things. 2, there's overlapping molecular genetic risk for ADHD in boys and self-injury in girls. And this is before the current massive GWAS studies. So these are dopamine transporter, for example. Self-injury marks prospective risk for borderline personality disorder. Women who develop borderline personality disorder are often reared in families with an antisocial brother, and this is really important. We've known this since Goldman wrote a fabulous paper back in 1993 about it. And there are strong sex biases in borderline personality disorder and ASPD diagnoses, and so most of you are probably aware of this. If you give people, diagnosticians, lists of symptoms, and they don't know the sex of the person with the symptoms, they sort them BPD, ASPD. If they know the sex of the person who presents with the symptoms, Many more go into BPD if it's a woman, and many more go into ASPD if it's a man. So that suggests some possible etiological connection indirectly. So our hypothesis was that impulsive girls with ADHD should be vulnerable to self-injury and borderline personality development, specifically in high-risk environments, the kind of high-risk environments that pull impulsive boys along the externalizing trajectory that I've already been talking about. There were insufficient data 10 years ago when we wrote these papers, actually probably more like 12 years ago that we wrote those papers. They were published 10 years ago. And all of that has changed now, and so what I want to spend most of the rest of our time on here is talking about that. And we have a paper that should come out in print any day, and I'll be describing what we review in that paper. So ADHD maltreatment and self-harm for girls. The Berkeley Girls with ADHD longitudinal study, which is run by Steve Hinshaw at Berkeley, of course, is the largest study of ADHD to date that has recruited only girls. There are other samples that have a minority representation of girls, some with enough girls to study sex differences, but not many because the inequivalence in ends. It included 140 girls ages 6 to 12 with ADHD. That's not very large by today's standards, but it was at the time that the data were collected. 93 combined and 47 inattentive. They were followed up in their late teens and early adulthood. Girls with the hyperactive, impulsive, and combined subtypes, and they were subtyped at the time, we didn't have DSM-5, who also incurred physical or sexual abuse exhibited alarming rates of self-injury and suicide attempts. And this has been confirmed in a couple of independent samples since. And so if we look at rates of self-injury and suicide attempts by risk status, here we have the population prevalence of self-injury, and it's alarming that it approaches 20%. So 20% of adolescent girls are dabbling in self-injury. If we look among maltreated samples, that rises to close to 30%. If we look in girls with ADHD, it rises a bit more. But if we look among girls with ADHD who have also incurred maltreatment, it rises to 50%. So 50% of these girls are engaging in self-injury, and I'm talking about significant self-injury, primarily cutting behavior. If we look at the population prevalence of suicide attempts, it's still very low, rising as we all know. If we look among maltreated samples, it rises more. Among ADHD samples, starts to approach 10%, but if we look among girls who have ADHD who also incurred maltreatment, that number rises to 33%. And so what we're arguing is that with those numbers now across 3 samples that I'm aware of, it's incumbent on us to formulate some sort of prevention program. We wouldn't look at numbers like this for anything else with this serious of consequences and wait for the disorder to develop. But that's essentially what we're doing most of the time. If we look at suicide rates for women from 1999 to 2014, these are CDC data, we see that suicide rates have risen in all age categories except 75 and older. What's going on here is that women are catching up with men, and not in a good way, clearly. The biggest increase, though, is among 10 to 14-year-olds. So in that 15-year span, the suicide rate for 10 to 14-year-olds increased 300%. And of course, these women who are at risk are going to move through these successive age categories and increase those rates as well. So the survivors who are vulnerable, of course. So one of the things that we wanted to do is evaluate what's going on in the families of self-injuring girls And we evaluated family interactions by bringing moms and daughters into the lab. So these are 13 to 17-year-olds. And this is some work that Sheila Kroll, who's a former graduate student, is most responsible for. And we had them come into the lab and list a bunch of issues that they typically argue about. And this is a common thing that's done in research in all kinds of research with adolescents. And then we pick an item to have them argue about for 10 minutes. That's not so aversive, if you will, that we think that they'll be placed at risk, but that's aversive enough that we know that we'll get a lot of disagreement and argument. And it works very well, surprisingly well. I can't imagine as an adolescent I would have done it, but they do. So we looked at patterns of autonomic nervous system reactivity between moms and girls during this task. And we had 3 groups: a depressed group, a self-injuring group, and a control group. Interestingly, even though we recruited these girls solely on the basis of significant self-harm, primarily cutting, the self-injury group scored in the clinical range on ADHD, which, following the story I've just told, isn't a big surprise, but it was perplexing to us at the time. The dyadic conflict task was engaged in, and we used a technique called nonlinear dynamic modeling, multi-state convergent cross-mapping, to be specific, and looked at girls' vagal and electrodermal reactivity to aversive behavior. And I'm only showing you a subset of data, but what we found, and what you can see here, is that the self-injuring girls, not the depressed-only girls, are exquisitely sensitive to their mother's aversive behaviors. And it's not a matter of a difference in levels of aversive behaviors. We didn't see that because we devised the task to be aversive. We saw similar levels across all groups. But it's the girls who engage in self-injury who are especially sensitive to their mom's criticisms and anger. We saw the same thing, so that's our parasympathetic measure. We saw the same thing with our sympathetic nervous system measure, electrodermal responding. So again, it's specifically the self-injuring girls who are showing really strong reactivity to their mom's aversive behaviors. And that extends previous work with ADHD boys to self-injuring girls. So we'd known this was going on among boys with ADHD. We also evaluated self-harming girls' neural responding to reward, and this was a first, so it's a small-scale study. We examined patterns of subcortical, striatal, and amygdala, and cortical, orbitofrontal cortex responding to incentives in self-injuring and controls. And again, even though we recruited them based solely on self-harm, ADHD symptoms were elevated with an effect size that was almost 1. We used Brian Knutson's monetary incentive delay task that I talked about earlier. And here here's a depiction of our findings where we found striatal, orbital, frontal, and amygdala regions in which self-injuring girls exhibited less neural activation to reward cues. Now, of course, we're not at a point where we can make diagnostic decisions based on scans, but if I were to show you these scans and say, what group difference does that reflect? You'd probably say, well, that's some ADHD boys responding to compared with controls, but these are self-injuring girls. So like boys with ADHD, girls recruited for self-harm show these blunted patterns of neural responding to incentives. We also evaluated cortical structure in the same sample and found smaller bilateral insula and right inferior frontal gyrus volumes. And the insula in particular is important for self and emotion regulation. And again, these findings parallel findings for externalizing males, adult women with borderline personality disorder, and adolescents on first presentation. And so we're recruiting based solely on self-harm, not based on borderline personality disorder, Some met criteria for borderline personality disorder, certainly not all of them, but our pattern of findings is very consistent with what you would expect in a borderline sample. So, quick summary for self-injuring girls. Like boys with ADHD, girls with ADHD are vulnerable to more severe psychopathology, specifically in high-risk environments. Behavioral trajectories, however, are moderated by sex. Boys are more vulnerable to delinquency. Girls are more vulnerable to self-injury. And of course, those aren't exclusive outcomes. Both of those can happen for boys. Both of those can happen for girls. Self-injuring girls with ADHD experience similar family dynamics as externalizing boys. They exhibit similar neural responses to incentives as externalizing boys. And now we are in a position to speculate, and I want to label this as speculation, sort of a unified developmental model where we've got in high-risk environments, vulnerable children with ADHD who are exposed to coercion, invalidation, maltreatment, abuse, neglect, progressing. And for girls up here in pink, that looks like ADHD to ODD, initiation of self-harm, worsening self-harm, substance abuse, suicidal behavior, suicide attempts, borderline personality disorder, whereas boys, we're looking at conduct problems, delinquency, substance use, criminality, criminal justice involvement. An interesting thing to note is that, as I already said, women who are girls who are on a borderline trajectory, boys who are on an antisocial trajectory, often come from the same families. And we also know that they often end up together, pairing together in relationships, whether that be marriage or otherwise. And so history repeats itself. So implications for suicide prevention. Highly impulsive young girls who also incur maltreatment are at 50% risk for NSSI, at 33% risk for eventual suicide attempts. Many girls now initiate non-suicidal self-injury before age 10. For any of you who have been in this business, if we can call it a business, as long as I have, which is 20 years, we didn't talk about this 20 years ago. If someone 20 years ago, when I first started out, had told me that an 8-year-old had suicided, I would say, you're kidding me. And now we don't say that anymore. And so we're seeing a regression, I guess, in age at which these behaviors are initiated. And these early starters exhibit greater frequency of non-suicidal self-injury. They use more diverse methods, and they're hospitalized more often. So like any form of psychopathology, earlier age of onset indicates greater severity. When delivered in adolescence, the best interventions are about 50% effective in reducing non-suicidal self-injury and suicidal behaviors. And what we need are interventions that target mediating mechanisms in pre-adolescence before the behaviors are initiated, because once they've been established, they're very hard to intervene with, as many of you in this room know. I'm going to skip this slide and move into some recent findings. And so now I'm going to shift gears a bit and talk about ADHD in adulthood. And to date, we have few longitudinal studies for boys or girls that assess real-world adult adjustment outcomes. We have some, but we don't have a whole lot. Treatment studies focus primarily on syndromal outcomes, hyperactivity and oppositionality. And this makes sense. We want to know if we're reducing hyperactivity, oppositional behaviors among hyperactive and oppositional samples. But that doesn't assess functional outcomes. New long-term follow-up studies are showing limited effects of evidence-based childhood treatment for ADHD on functional outcomes. And this is an interesting talk, but in and of itself to talk about. Steve Henshaw has written a couple of these papers on the MTA trial with Gene Arnold at OSU. And the data are kind of depressing. we're seeing educational attainment, income, high-risk sexual behavior, jail time, social skills, employment transitions, terminations, public assistance, alcohol use disorder, premature death, all relatively unaffected by early treatment for ADHD. So what we've moved into assessing some functional outcomes in adulthood, and this is a really weird collaboration. I have to explain it for a couple of minutes. I was approached by some of our faculty at the Fisher College of Business at Ohio State about looking at financial behaviors in adults with ADHD. And we had to meet a couple of times for them to convince me that it was worth my time or effort, and it turns out to be. And this is the first paper that we wrote. It was we used MTurk, I'm embarrassed to admit it. Had never done it before, but it gave us the impetus for doing something larger scale. And what we evaluated was self-reported financial outcomes among those who also reported high levels of impulsive behaviors consistent with ADHD. Now, of course, they're self-reporting, so I don't place a lot of stock in the findings. But what we found is that those who were reporting high levels of impulsivity, consistent with diagnoses of ADHD, are doing things like using pawn shops a lot, using payday loans a lot. I mean, these aren't surprising things, but they stood up to a lot of covariates, including substance use. They're delinquent on their credit cards. They're paying interest rates for their credit that are like 28% compared to what I hope the rest of us are paying. And so this made us curious, and so we looked a little bit deeper. And so the data I'm going to report now are in revision, and we looked at impulsivity, financial distress, and suicide outcomes in the entire Swedish population, the kind of thing you don't get to do here in the United States because we don't have the data. So we have ICD diagnostic codes obtained between 2002 and 2015 for all Swedish adults, 11,549,184, including 176,350 ever diagnosed with ADHD. And so everyone has to report, all providers have to report data to the Swedish authorities. We obtained also objective credit data, including requests for credit, credit arrears, credit scores from the Swedish Credit Bureau. This is in collaboration, of course, with a collaborator over in Sweden. The goal was to replicate and extend our previous self-report findings regarding financial distress and poor credit among adults with ADHD. And so I look at MTurk differently than I used to because it generated some good ideas. The very large sample afforded a bunch of different opportunities that we were interested in evaluating. What are associations between ADHD and financial outcomes by age? What are associations between ADHD, prescriptions for ADHD, and financial behaviors? Does getting medication for ADHD help with financial behavior or not? What are associations between financial outcomes and suicide by age? And no one has ever looked at this before. So I'm going to just show some graphs that summarize our findings. And the first graph here shows credit requests per month. So this is just asking for credit cards and the like, and from age 18 to age 68. And the big expanding confidence intervals out at the end just means there's not that many people diagnosed with ADHD in that age range, even if they have it. And what we see here is really not much difference between controls. Oh, and by the way, this line here, that does include a 95% confidence interval, but with 11 million people, that's a pretty narrow confidence interval. So, at about, I don't know what age this is, the angle is difficult. We'll move. At about age 30 or so, we start to see a divergence in credit requests, where those with ADHD are asking for a lot more credit than those without ADHD. If we look at new consumer credit, so is credit actually being granted following the request, we see really no difference between those with and without ADHD until, I don't know, somewhere in the mid-50s it looks like, and then people with ADHD start to get more credit. I don't know what to make of that. One could devise a story, I suppose, but that's not really the important stuff here. So here we have new arrears per month. And arrears, of course, means you're not paying something. It could be alimony. That was a huge one. It could be something as mundane as parking tickets. That was a huge one. It could be your credit card bills. And it really didn't matter. People, adults with ADHD, weren't paying their bills across the board and were suffering a lot of arrears. And as you can see, in the 40-year-old age range, arrears are 3 times or more among the ADHD group than among those without ADHD. When we look at percentage with ADHD in different default risk bins of credit, and in Sweden, high credit is a bad thing. You don't want a high credit score in Sweden. This is the population prevalence of ADHD, and one thing you'll notice is 1.5% is much lower than we have in the United States, so they're more conservative in their diagnostic practices there. What you'll see is enormous overrepresentation of adults with ADHD in the worst credit score bins. Not a surprise, but no one had shown this. If we look at new arrears per month, on the y-axis here, and time from first prescription for ADHD, so we go from -2 years to +2 years following first prescription. We found no association between prescriptions and new arrears per month. So it doesn't appear, at least in this large data set, that prescriptions for ADHD are helping financial behaviors. If we look at suicides per 100,000, we see more suicides. And there are a number of covariates that are corrected here, so we can get values that are actually below 0, which we have here for the no ADHD group. But there are more suicides across all ages for the ADHD group than for the no ADHD group. This is not a surprise. There are a number of studies that have shown this before. Here we have suicides per 100,000 and credit scores, and we combined the 11 default risk bins into 4 to get adequate numbers to do this. And what we see here is that there are a lot more suicides per 100,000 for those with ADHD and poor credit. If we look down here among those with ADHD and okay credit, the differences are not nearly as large. Here is the suicide rate in the population. If we look at outstanding arrears in the time before suicide, so this looks at 3 years before suicide, what we see is that for those with ADHD who suicide, things are getting worse for them financially in the 3 years before they suicide. For those without ADHD who suicide, we don't see any such thing, so their financial situation is unrelated. We're not suggesting that financial problems are causing people to suicide, but it suggests something about the level of chaos in their life in the years leading up to suicide. That's all I have, and I would love to have presented some of our treatment data. I want to acknowledge contributions from 3 people in particular, Steve Hinshaw, who's been a fabulous friend and collaborator for many years, Lisa Gatsky-Cobb, Sheila Kroll, and then I have a bunch of other collaborators here, some of whom are in this room, and here are all my Seattle connections. I hadn't realized that and some of these people I met since I was living here in Seattle years ago, so and thank you anyway for inviting me and coming today.
Thank you for such a sweeping story. It's just impressive journey that you're describing. I'm interested in your response. You said you weren't going to talk about treatment. I have a question about treatment.
Sure.
And longitudinal course, and I've thought about this forever. And on the one hand, it's not so much different from early childhood interventions. The early daycare studies were similar. They weren't showing any effect until the kid was in 5th grade, and they almost fell apart at the same time. And what you suggest is that there is, in fact, a signal that happens. You just have to wait for it with a wide-ranging intervention. On the other hand, if you look at the ADHD trials, MTA in particular, it's now out to 12 years. I'm not sure how far they're going to go, but it's a long time downstream. And Willie Heckman's looked at these kids 20 years later, and kids still have ADHD. That's clearly the case. And the longitudinal construct that you're describing is this maintenance of impulsivity and vulnerability to other sorts of issues. And that sort of long-winded background leads to this question: is it your sense that in terms of these long-term consequences of this, are these treatment failures, or is it a failure of the application of dose and intervention? Because all of the short-term trials for ADHD are fine. You look at them at age 4, they're good. At age 8, they're good. At age 20, they're good. Age 35, they look okay. And MTA is fine at 14 months, but they stop giving stuff at that point. And I don't know, my question is it just a matter of not continuing a fine-tuned intervention, or there's really something about this impulsivity dimension that's impervious to intervention?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about too. The way I think about it is that this is a fixed, stable, lifelong personality trait that needs a fixed, stable, lifelong treatment approach. And I think the same way about trait anxiety. I guess that's the short answer. And so interventions like MTA, which were successful when implemented, as soon as we back off, and many kids are back to living a disorganized life in a disorganized family, and there's no consistency and follow-up, then we get unfortunate outcomes. That's how I think about it. Sounds like you may too. Yeah.
And so that was excellent. Since you think about things sort of from this longitudinal big picture aspect, the girl data is sort of this bigger issue that, kids, for the last generation, we as a field have spent all this time trying to make schools better places, to have less bullying, to sort of decrease stigma, to get people into treatment, and the suicide rates are skyrocketing. Kids are reporting more anxiety and depression, and so A, it didn't work, or B, we've created a toxic culture, or C, President Trump's responsible for it all.
No. Thanks, Obama.
Yeah, exactly. So anyways, I guess thoughts about either the cultural aspects and also how you measure longitudinal studies when things are changing in this bigger picture issue that are clearly influencing the outcomes of the patients you're looking at.
Yeah, those are really good questions and really difficult ones. I'm not sure I have, there's probably so much more wisdom in this room than anything I could bring because of who you see and who you spend your time with from day to day compared with who I see and who I spend my time with from day to day. But why the increase in self-injury and suicide? Why the regression into, it's not the right word, but you know what I mean, into earlier and earlier ages? I don't have my head wrapped around that at all. The only thing or one thing that comes to mind is I wish I could outlaw Facebook, but yeah. Mark Zuckerberg won't be going for that. Yeah.
So welcome back to Seattle, Ted. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Terrific presentation. You present back some slides, that beautiful model that includes girls and boys going from, the risk to ODD and moving forward. And of course, my question is, where do we put depression? Where does depression come into this, given that we know, both depression and anxiety, given that we know that it's a high overlap with ADHD in both of these, in both boys and girls?
Yeah, I am. I'm thrilled that the field is moving, more and more toward transdiagnostic conceptualizations with, and that the RDoC matrix is being populated, and that we're doing so much work on that. And the striatal dysfunction that I talked about, or vulnerability that I talked about, cuts across unipolar depressive disorders and externalizing disorders. And that paper I referenced that Amy Zisner and I wrote together is way too long for anyone to have to read, but it goes into all of these issues that you're talking about. And so it's just impossible to capture it all in one talk or one model, but depression is in here. Another thing that I didn't talk about at all was callous unemotional traits, which go in here as well and make kids more vulnerable, and it's just a matter of not being able to cover it all. But that core neural vulnerability to anhedonia, irritability, there have been a couple of papers that have come out in addition to ours that sort of address this very issue. So, yeah.
This really fascinating stuff, and thank you so much for presenting it. It would be interesting to have in the room some, early childhood or fourth trimester, advocates who have been talking to us a lot about, early intervention, especially early relational health, and looking at that as a sort of universal preventive model. How does that sort of pair up with that observation of yours about, some of these kids needing sort of a lifelong, intervention, and
Right.
Or how do we put those things together, especially for those of us who are looking for sort of, public health magic bullets?
Right. Yeah, I've thought about this a lot too, and one of the most depressing things for me to have observed over the past 30 years is the enormous and increasing wealth disparity in our country, and how more and more kids are getting less and less prenatally, postnatally, and that is not only in terms of nutrition, it's in terms of adequate parenting and community resources, and I wish I had even an inkling of how to address that. I sort of have compartmentalized myself into my professional life, going home and watching the news and going to bed depressed. It would be great to have that conversation. I just wish we could mount investment in all the right places. Although my stock portfolio is doing well.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your combining like economic aspects into your model and trying to explain, some of the gender differences in presentation. And I guess piggybacking on Chris's comments, I was just thinking about it's very convincing in terms of the similar mechanisms in terms of striatal hypofunctioning and course. But I guess I'm wondering if there are differences in treatment. Thinking about especially the females that are less likely to be treated, especially if they walk into the door related to bipolar disorder or cutting. Are they less likely to be treated for ADHD, and would that be part of it? And when we say ADHD plus maltreatment, is that also a marker for less treatment, and then interacting with lower SES? Just wondering about those things.
Those are fabulous questions too, and those are ones that I haven't thought so much about, but I would clearly be on the agenda for folks here. Most of my effort is going into thinking about, if we're at that point, we're later than I'd like to be. And so what do we do before we get to that point? So I imagine that everyone could answer those questions better than I can, but they're important.
I remember Sheila Kroll being in the same room giving grand rounds, and she had this moment where she was talking about the relationship between impulsivity and cutting and, you know, parasympathetic reactivity. And our DBT psychiatrist was like, oh my gosh, you are validating my practice that in our DBT program, I'm identifying ADHD in all these girls who are having chronic suicidality and cutting behavior. And I thought I would be mostly adjusting SSRI doses, but really what I'm doing is managing a lot of impulsivity. So it was very validating to the DBT team, and I think that's continued to be a theme. But again, very late, right? That's, you know, after they've already gotten into a pattern of
Right.
chronic suicidality.
Right. And now that's obviously very, very important intervention work. I'd love it if we could prevent even a fraction of those young women from getting to that point. Yeah.
So, thanks. This has been a great talk. This is Michelle Garrison. So one of the things I see in looking at this is that this is similar in some ways to the gender differences we see in the effects of like long-term inadequate sleep, which is obviously highly associated with ADHD. And I'm wondering to what degree you've been able to look at that in any of this work, either to see if it might be having a mediating or moderating role in these models.
None. We haven't put sleep into our models. It's only sort of come onto my radar in the last couple of years. We're doing some work right now on sleep and autism spectrum disorder that, of course, I didn't talk about today. But no, that hasn't gone into our thinking to date. I would love to talk with you about that. Yeah.
This is fascinating. Yes, this is fascinating. What I'm wondering about earlier on here is what pulls the girls in one direction and the boys in a different direction. They have the underlying phenotype, but their behavioral manifestations are different. Have you speculated at all about that?
Yeah, I have some speculations about that, and I'll label them as such. If we go back to, they're of two kinds, right? One has to do with neurohormonal modulation, and for women, we've got those progesterone and estradiol inputs that we don't have for boys. And then we've got testosterone for boys that's contributed differentially and is linked, of course, to aggression. The other issue is that for boys, development of instrumental aggression pays off in ways that it doesn't for girls because they're smaller. Engaging in instrumental aggression as a girl might pay off here and there, but it's not going to pay off to the extent that it does for boys. So those are some of the possibilities, I think. Do you have anything else in mind? Yeah.
Well, Ted, it was wonderful to have you back. Obviously, you've provoked so much thinking, and I'm sure we'll continue to ponder these important questions as we leave and go back to our work. So thank you for coming. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, Anne.